Welcome to Baha'i Books and Authors, a podcast which introduces to you writers and the works they've penned related to the Baha'i faith. We'll explore the inspiration, the process, and the stories behind their work. I'm your host, Jan Grammer. This podcast is produced by World Unity Media, which also produces Baha'i audiobooks. Who was Roy Wilhelm? Servant to the Servants answers that question and so much more in this all-encompassing biography of this businessman, Wall Street industrialist, stalwart servant of the Baha'i faith, later elevated to the rank of Hand of the Cause of God. Roy learned about Baha'u'llah from his mother, Lori, who first heard about the faith in the late 1890s. He wasn't attracted to it until he accompanied his mother on her pilgrimage to Haifa. He was transformed and became a deeply committed Baha'i from that time forward. How did he become a trusted confidant to both Abdu'l-Bahá and Shoghi Effendi? What was his pivotal role in the establishment of the administrative order in America? There was the unexpected moment that brought him into contact with a person who would become one of the most dedicated, extensive travel teachers and revered early believers. This book is full of remarkable stories of a man whom we knew little about, a man whom the master loved and cherished, and whom the guardian referred to as an immovable pillar. I'm delighted to have the authors join me. Welcome, Joel Neisen, Kathy Hoganson, and Gary Hoganson. Joel, what inspired you to write about Roy Wilhelm?
I moved to New Jersey in the 1980s, very close to his property in Teaneck. The annual souvenir picnic, which Abdu'l-Bahá started in 1912 and was told by 1913 that it should be an annual event, occurs at that property the last Saturday of June. I started to attend, and I became interested in the history of the property and the history of the picnic. As time went on, my interest grew, just as when you ask questions, you get additional questions, and I began to research Roy Wilhelm's life. And I went to archives in New York, in Chicago, Washington, D.C., to learn more about his life. I traveled to Maine, where he had a second home. It became an obsession almost that lasted more than 25 years.
Were there any surprising discoveries as you researched the project and began to write the book?
What was fascinating to me was having interviews with people who actually knew him, some of which I was able to obtain and others obtained for me, to actually learn the personal details of his life. You can read about his letters and his accomplishments, but to me it was really interesting to get all those personal, quirky stories that everyone loved to tell about him.
What were some of the challenges you faced, if any, in bringing Roy's story to life?
Going to the National Archives in Chicago, there were thousands of documents that referred to Roy Wilhelm in various archives, and it took many visits to copy them and categorize them and understand people's handwriting, because they weren't all typewritten. There were a lot of handwriting which was difficult to read, and it's just like a jigsaw puzzle where you find one piece and you want to find another piece.
He was a very successful businessman. Do you think that this influenced his services to the faith?
The early administration of the Baha'i faith was often with people who did not have a lot of business experience. He was able to set the National Spiritual Assembly on very good financial grounds because of his knowledge of finance and business. His participation in local levels at the New York City Local Spiritual Assembly, on national committees, on publishing trusts, on his professional career, which involved groups of arbitration in the coffee business. He had a wealth of experience that he was able to offer to the National Assembly to help that early growth of the administration.
He was a very active teacher of the faith. And, as you say, a very important administrator in the nascent Baha'i administration. Do you think that any of that informs the ways the Baha'i community of today acts or functions?
There's so much guidance now from the Universal House of Justice of the core activities with children's class, junior youth class, Ruhi Institute, deepenings, home visits, that were not available at that time. The amount of guidance that Roy Wilhelm had was directly from the central figures of the faith. He was encouraged directly by Abdu'l-Bahá and Shoghi Effendi to proceed in certain ways, which he did. He protected the faith. He published early documents called Little and Big Ben that were some of the earliest teaching materials. So at his time in history, it was incredible the amount that he was able to accomplish. We have so many more tools nowadays which give us the benefit of the guidance of the Universal House of Justice, which he did not have. But again, we don't get to talk to the central figures of the faith now either.
Kathy, tell us about Roy's deep friendship with Martha Root, a sterling teacher and servant of the faith herself, elevated to the rank of foremost hand of the cause of God after her passing.
Martha and Roy had a very unique relationship. They were, in many ways, like brother and sister. In fact, she considered his parents to be a second set of parents. They were that close. But also, Roy was her spiritual father, the one who introduced her to the Baha'i faith. And there's actually a very nice story about how that came about. Roy had gone to the Holy Land on what we refer to as a pilgrimage with his mother, and this turned out to be the turning point in his full acceptance of the faith and unquestioned devotion to it after that very amazing experience with Abdu'l-Bahá there in the Haifa-Akka area. When he came back, his business as a coffee broker required him to travel around the United States to visit with various customers, coffee roasters, restaurants, all sorts of people around the United States who were buying his product. And one of his stops was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He got to the hotel late at night, and the hotel desk clerk informed him that the hotel's kitchen was already closed for the night, but that Chow's restaurant, one that was well known in downtown Pittsburgh, was still open for the evening and that he might be able to get a dinner there. So he was amazed at the late hour that when he got to the restaurant, it was packed. In fact, the hostess or host who was seating him had to put him at a small table in the back of the restaurant where he could barely move because of the sheer number of patrons at that strange late hour. It turned out that this was because a convention was being held in Pittsburgh for Christians who were interested in promoting the Christian missionary movement. He had been seated next to a table where two women were having a very heated discussion about the heathen. So Roy was quite tempted to jump in and talk about this argument with them, but decided to hold his tongue. And just then the ladies got up to leave. And because they couldn't get past him unless he stood up to make way for them, he stopped the group and said, "I'm sorry, ladies, but I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. I just returned from accompanying my mother to the Holy Land, and there we saw people of a variety of faiths who seemed very sincere. They prayed to God just like we do, and they seemed to me to be very fine people. So maybe God does care about all those who worship him, no matter in what name." Well, the lady he thought would respond to that just went right on past him. But one of the members of the table, as she passed him by, slipped him her calling card, her business card. She was a journalist and was the social affairs and religion journalist for a Pittsburgh newspaper and was there covering the conference. And the name on the card was Martha Root. So, being the good salesman, which is essentially what he was for a living, he got home and he sent her a Baha'i book. She wasn't at all interested. She gave it to somebody else, but she wrote him a polite letter thanking him. Well, he considered that letter to be an opening, so he continued. He sent more books. She kept giving them away. And finally, he had to return to Pittsburgh on business and suggested that they have lunch together. So they did. They had a 2-hour lunch. And this journalist asked Roy all kinds of questions about the faith. And from that moment on, her spiritual quest was truly launched. And the two became extremely close friends to the degree that Martha was calling Roy's name on her deathbed. So these two spiritual titans reinforced each other. And I'm sure that both of them benefited from this incredible friendship that lasted a number of decades.
So he was a main and instrumental supporter of Martha Root in her later many, many travels for the faith. And Joel mentioned Big and Little Ben's. How did Roy help Martha Root in her teaching around the world?
Itinerary that she followed was given to Roy so that he would know where she was next. And he would often forward some money 20, 50 pounds, whatever, to her next location, which she would then pay him back. So to say that he sponsored her, he forwarded funds which were uniformly paid back. She was able to have money from an inheritance and from her work as a journalist. She continued to work as a journalist on all of her travels. Part of her suitcase, she had one suitcase that had these little and big bends. That was the contents of the suitcase. So when she would meet people and interact with them, that would be the teaching materials that she would offer. There were very few teaching materials printed at that time. So actually, Queen Marie of Romania was a recipient of some of these materials, and many, many other people.
We should add that the bends were a collection of Baha'i tablets and prayers. They were not introductory material. It was a collection of the holy writings. Roy would arrange to have the bends translated into other languages. So when she's traveling through South America, she has a suitcase full of them in Spanish. When she's in Europe, they're being translated into a variety of languages so that she can pass them out in her teaching work.
They were in Esperanto, in Braille. I'm aware that there were probably more than 20 different languages that they were translated into.
I didn't know that. I wondered how these teaching materials were distributed to people in various countries in English. Thank you very much for clarifying that. Gary, we were talking about Roy's leadership qualities that he got from being the kind of businessman that he was. Was there anything that stood out for you about those qualities?
I look at Roy as a frank and honest businessman. His integrity is, for me, a model for us. And I hate to make this a personal story, but, I spent almost a year every day with Roy. We became buddies, and 8 hours a day, he and I talked. And so for me, of course, this was all part of a personal transformation that helped me as I went forward. I look at Roy as being a paradigm of honesty and trustworthiness, of someone who has money but is not ostentatious. And he used the money for his faith.
In addition, as a green coffee bean importer, there were a lot of unscrupulous other importers at the time in New York City. Wall Street, New York, was the center of the import business for this product, where millions of pounds of coffee beans would come through the port. And some of the importers would claim that their beans came from one plantation as opposed to another of a different quality, or they would put objects in the coffee bean bags to make the bag weigh more. There was actual physical violence between the coffee importers. In 1917, arbitration board was set up so that this would not happen anymore, Roy being a part of this arbitration board. So that when there were disputes of where the coffee came from, instead of having a fist fight in the middle of the Wall Street, they could go to an arbitration board. Part of that was that Roy was a taster, so that having lived in Costa Rica for a number of years, at least 3 years, he was able to distinguish qualities of coffee, so he could tell as a taster, it's like a nose for perfume, where the bean came from. So part of settling arbitration was saying, yes, this bean is really from this plantation and not that one. It's another one of his attributes that instead of fomenting dissension and warfare, he elevated it to a different process of arbitration in a peaceful way.
That's really interesting. So was Roy Wilhelm a Baha'i at this time? So he brought in Baha'i principles of consultation, or was this before that time?
Roy became informed of the faith from his mother probably by 1899 or 1900, and he was not a firm believer. But when his parents came to visit him in New York City, where he was living after 1901, the mother would take him to all sorts of Baha'i meetings, so Roy became knowledgeable of some of the Baha'i principles. So we know for sure he's a Baha'i by 1907, but there's a lot going on before then, and there are actually letters from Abdu'l-Bahá to Roy before 1907, asking him to do various tasks, some which were financial, some were protection of the faith, that he was asked to do before 1907. So Roy is a Baha'i way before this arbitration board.
As a follow-up, this biography of Roy Wilhelm, Servant to the Servants, this could be a guidebook for us as Baha'is on how to live our life, on what we do to make a living as business people or teachers or whatever. Roy was truly an inspiration to me, and I wish I'd had an opportunity to read the book or to know Roy when I was younger, because it would have been a transformative time in my life to learn how to really live my life and to emulate him and what he did. And that no matter what point in his life, whether he was a young man or middle-aged man or even an elderly person, the faith always came first. As I think about it, as I get an older person, that I can't quit either.
All of us, we can't quit. We have to keep going as much as we can. Kathy, there was a time when Roy played a pivotal role in the communications between Abdu'l-Bahá and the American Baha'is. Can you tell us about that role?
He had his office on Wall Street. Now, he's a coffee broker. Coffee brokers have to have a cable address. They're sending international cables. They're sending funds between countries at a time when international banking didn't make that very easy. He was the perfect person to be dealing with international correspondence between the Baha'i World Center in the Holy Land and North America. The fact that he was so trustworthy, he knew how to keep a confidence. Horace Holly, his colleague, many years later said that for more than 20 years, Roy's office on Wall Street was the unofficial headquarters of the Baha'i faith in North America.
Joel, what do you hope readers will take away from your book that might influence their own lives?
You indicated at the beginning of the interview that not that many people knew the stories of Roy Wilhelm. And I believe that learning about these early heroes and heroines inspires us greatly. Some of them were martyrs, killed for their faith, who did incredible things at the very beginning part of the history of the Baha'i faith. But then you see individuals who contributed greatly, who didn't die, didn't shed their life blood, but shed their blood in other ways by their dedicated service. It would be wonderful if the readers took that lesson away and realized the significance of some of these early heroes, which they know in generality, but now with Kathy and Gary's help, they have it in story form, because people respond to stories usually much better. That's why we keep telling stories, because it helps the understanding. The book is full of stories.
I want to thank all of you so much for joining me today and sharing all that you have shared. Servant to the Servants, Roy C. Wilhelm, Hand of the Cause of God by Joel Neisen, Catherine Jewett Hoganson, and Gary L. Hoganson is available on Baha'iBookstore.com or wherever you get your distribution services. Subscribe or follow Baha'i Books and Authors with your chosen podcast platform. This podcast is produced by World Unity Media.